In this video, we'll take a look at the criminals who, after spending years on death row, were executed in 1985. We'll examine their crimes, the trials that sealed their fate, their last meals, their final words, and ultimately their execution. Welcome to Criminal Records. David Dean Martin, State, Louisiana. On August 14, 1977, 25-year-old David Martin went to a trailer home in Bayou Blue, Louisiana, where Bobby Todd, his wife's lover, was living. When he arrived, he found Todd with three other people: Terry Hebert, 27, and Ann Tierney and Sandra Brake, both 19. Martin opened fire inside the home, firing 15 shots. Todd was hit twice in the chest. Hebert was shot 5 times. 2 bullets pierced his heart. Tierney was shot 6 times in the chest, abdomen, and face. Brake was struck in the heart and showed signs of defensive wounds. Martin was arrested the next day and charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder. His trial took place in April 1978 in Lafourche Parish. On April 11th, he was found guilty, and on April 24th, he was sentenced to death following a unanimous jury recommendation. Martin's execution was initially scheduled for February 13, 1981, but was delayed due to a federal appeal. A second date was set for September 18, 1981, but that too was postponed. A third execution order was finally issued for January 4, 1985. One day before the execution, the Louisiana Board of Pardons denied his clemency request, despite his lawyers arguing that emotional instability and substance abuse had contributed to the crime. Martin declined to make a final statement. His last meal was sloppy joes with French fries. He was executed in the electric chair on January 4, 1985, at the Louisiana State Penitentiary. He was 32 years old. Martin became the 33rd person executed in the U.S., after the death penalty was reinstated in 1976, and the 7th executed in Louisiana since 1983. Roosevelt Green, State, Georgia. In December 1976, Roosevelt Green and Carzell Moore took part in the robbery of the Magic Market in Cochran, Georgia, where 18-year-old student Teresa Villancico Allen was working. Allen was abducted, sexually assaulted by both men, and murdered with a high-powered rifle. Her body was found 2 days later, bearing multiple gunshot wounds and signs of violent assault. Her car was later discovered in South Carolina in Green's possession. He had attempted to dispose of both the vehicle and the weapon. Forensic evidence and witness testimony linked both men to the crime. During the trial, Moore changed his story, denying that he had ever confessed and claiming he had been drinking and watching television the night of the murder. Green, on the other hand, consistently maintained his innocence. Although Moore initially implicated Green, he later stated that Green had not pulled the trigger. Despite multiple appeals, the Georgia Board of Pardons and Paroles denied Green's request for clemency. On Tuesday, December 10, 1985, Roosevelt Green was executed in the electric chair shortly after midnight. His mother was present in the execution chamber, becoming one of the few mothers in Georgia to witness the death of her child. Green did not request a last meal. His final words were, "Goodbye, Mother." Joseph Carl Shaw. State, South Carolina. In 1977, Joseph Carl Shaw was involved in a series of brutal crimes in Richland County, South Carolina, along with accomplices James Terry Roach, Brian Mahaffey, and a man named Williams. Following a breakup and under the influence of drugs and alcohol, the group decided to commit violent acts. On October 17th, they abducted, raped, and murdered Betty Swank. Shaw shot her with a .22 caliber pistol. Then, on October 29th, Shaw, Roach, and Mahaffey approached Thomas Taylor and Carlotta Hartness at a stadium. Roach shot Taylor, while Shaw and the others raped Hartness. Afterward, Roach and Shaw shot her in the head, killing her. Later that same night, Shaw returned to the scene to mutilate her body. The three were arrested on November 3, 1977. Shaw pled guilty and was sentenced to death for the murders of Taylor and Hartness and to life in prison for Swank's murder. Roach also received the death penalty. Mahaffey, who was a minor at the time, was sentenced to life in exchange for his testimony. Williams was sentenced to life in a separate trial. One day before his execution, Shaw was offered a last meal. He chose pizza and salad. Joseph Carl Shaw was executed in the electric chair on January 11, 1985, at the age of 29. His final words were an apology to the victims' families. "I want to apologize to all three families, the Swanks, the Taylors, and the Hartnesses. I hope you can find some peace once all the publicity about me ends. Killing was wrong when I did it, and it's wrong when you do it. I hold no grudges against anyone. God bless you all, and may He forgive you." Doyle Edward Skillern, State, Texas. In 1974, Doyle Edward Skillern was involved in the murder of state narcotics agent Patrick Randall during an undercover drug operation in Beeville, Texas. Randall, 40, had arranged to purchase Quaaludes from Skillern and his accomplice, Charles Victor Sana, using $850 in state funds. After the supposed transaction, Randall vanished. That same night, both suspects were arrested near the Mexican border. Skillern was found carrying the state's money, Randall's service weapon, and his wedding ring. Hours later, Randall's body was discovered inside his car. He had been shot 6 times in the chest and abdomen. At trial, prosecutors presented strong evidence, surveillance of the drug deal, Randall's personal items found with the suspects, and the murder weapon, which was recovered weeks later. Skillern was sentenced to death, while Sana received life in prison. This was not Skillern's first murder. In 1971, he had killed his own brother and buried the body under a concrete slab. He served only 2 years for that crime before being released in May 1974, just 5 months before Randall's murder. While on death row, Sana tried to take full responsibility for the shooting, but his testimony wasn't considered credible. In 1981, Skillern learned he had a daughter, and the two spoke briefly before his execution. Doyle Edward Skillern was executed by lethal injection on January 16, 1985. When asked for his final words, he said, "I pray that my family rejoices and forgives. Thank you." James David Raulerson, State, Florida. In 1975, James David Raulerson was sentenced to death for the murder of police officer Mike Stewart following a robbery at a Jacksonville, Florida restaurant, where a waitress was also sexually assaulted. During the getaway, Raulerson and his cousin, Jerry Tant, exchanged gunfire with police. Officer Stewart was shot in the head and killed during the confrontation, and Tant was also killed. Raulerson was arrested shortly afterward. At trial, prosecutors presented evidence that Raulerson's .38 caliber revolver had fired the shot that killed Officer Stewart. Raulerson, however, consistently denied being the one who fired the fatal shot. In his final statement, he claimed that Stewart's partner, Officer James English, had accidentally shot Stewart and then used Stewart's weapon to kill Tant. This claim was dismissed by the prosecution, who maintained that Officer English never fired his weapon during the incident. James David Raulerson was executed in the electric chair on October 30, 1985, at the age of 33. He spent 10 years on death row. He declined to make a final statement and did not request a specific last meal. Van Roosevelt Solomon, State, Georgia. In 1979, Van Roosevelt Solomon, a former assistant Baptist pastor from Lawton, Oklahoma, was sentenced to death for the murder of Roger Tackett. a Georgetown University honors graduate who had left his teaching job because it didn't pay enough to support his family. Tackett was working as a convenience store manager in Cobb County, Georgia, at the time of his death. During an armed robbery, Solomon and his accomplice, Brandon Jones, killed Tackett. The crime was especially brutal, with the prosecution describing it as murder by torture. Both men received death sentences, though Jones remained on death row for decades, appealing his case. Roosevelt Solomon was executed in the electric chair on February 15, 1984, at the age of 41, at the Georgia Diagnostic and Classification Center. He spent 4 years on death row and was the 5th person executed in Georgia since the reinstatement of the death penalty. For his last meal, he requested fruit and chocolate ice cream. Before his execution, Solomon offered these final words: "I would like to give my blessings to all the people who tried to save my life." John Paul Witt, in State, Florida. In 1973, John Paul Witt, a 29-year-old homeless man, kidnapped and brutally murdered Jonathan Kushner, an 11-year-old boy and son of a dean at the University of South Florida. The crime took place in the upscale Carrollwood neighborhood of Tampa, where the boy had gone to a convenience store to buy candy for his younger brother. According to authorities, Witt and his accomplice, Gary L. Tillman, stalked the boy, followed him to the store, and intercepted him as he arrived on his bicycle. They then kidnapped and murdered him in a particularly cruel manner. The crime shocked the community and was described by the governor as a particularly brutal murder. Witt was arrested, tried, and sentenced to death in 1974. In his final days, he refused all interaction. He did not speak to prison officials, rejected visits from a minister, declined to give a final statement, and also refused his last meal. On March 4, 1986, John Paul Witt was executed in Florida's electric chair, known as Old Sparky. A 2,000-volt current was applied for 90 seconds, causing his death at 7:10 a.m. He was 41 years old at the time. When asked if he wanted to say any last words, he quietly replied, "No, I have none." Witnesses reported that during the execution, Witt suddenly sat up and struggled against the straps, though he had remained calm beforehand. Stephen Peter Morin, State, Texas. In the 1970s, Stephen Peter Morin roamed the United States as a drifter struggling with addiction. Behind this wandering life, however, was one of the country's most wanted criminals. Authorities suspect he was involved in at least 48 violent crimes, mostly targeting young women across several states. In 1976, Morin was charged in San Francisco with assaulting a 14-year-old girl, putting him on the FBI's radar. From that point on, he used multiple false identities and continued his trail of violence through California, Nevada, Utah, Colorado, Texas, and beyond. In January 1980, he tried to forcibly abduct 19-year-old Susan Billot in Las Vegas, but she managed to escape. Then, in June, 20-year-old Cheryl Ann Daniel disappeared after an encounter with Morin. Her body was found 6 months later in Utah, along with belongings that directly linked Morin to the crime. The pattern continued in 1981. In Colorado, he was responsible for the death of 23-year-old Sheila Whalen. Then, in Texas, he took the life of 21-year-old Jana Bruce. On December 11th of that year, in San Antonio, Morin attempted to steal a car and ended up shooting 21-year-old Carrie Ann Scott in a restaurant parking lot. Shortly afterward, he kidnapped Margie Mayfield, holding her captive for more than 10 hours while on the run. Morin was arrested the next day, December 12th, at a bus station in Austin. During his trials, he pleaded guilty to several of the most clear-cut crimes, including those of Scott, Bruce, and Daniel. He was sentenced to death in both Texas and Colorado. Although extradition to Utah was planned for other charges, it never happened. In prison, Morin converted to Christianity and refused any appeals. His lawyer tried to stop the execution, citing mental health issues, but the request was denied. On March 13, 1985, Stephen Morin was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville prison in Texas. His partner and some victims' family members were present. Due to his medical history, it took technicians 45 minutes to find a viable vein. His last meal was steak, baked potato with butter, pea salad, banana pudding, and coffee. His final words were, "Father, forgive these people, for they don't know what they're doing. Forgive them as you have forgiven me, and I have forgiven them. Lord Jesus, I commend my soul to you." Morin was pronounced dead at 12:55 a.m. He spent less than 2 years on death row. John Young. State, Georgia. In 1974, at just 17 years old, John Young was accused of taking part in a violent series of attacks in Macon, Georgia. On one December night, 3 elderly people were killed and 3 others injured after being attacked in their own homes. Young was arrested shortly afterward and formally charged with these crimes. Despite his young age, Young was tried as an adult. His defense was handled by a lawyer who was later disbarred for professional misconduct, a failure that would become a key argument in appeals years later. However, the United States Supreme Court, in a 5-3 decision, refused to stay his execution. The Tuesday before his execution, Young received visits from his sisters, a cousin, his partner, and a minister. He also spoke for the last time with his new attorney, who expressed doubts about the fairness of his trial. Young replied, "I don't think I got a fair trial either, but I'm ready to face death." On October 8, 1985, John Young was executed in the electric chair at the Georgia Diagnostic and Classification Center at 12:26 a.m., witnessed by 12 people. In his final statement, he spoke about racial discrimination in the United States, quietly saying, "Being born black in America was against me. You all shout that America was built on Christianity. I say it was built on slavery." John Young was 28 years old at the time of his execution and spent 11 years on death row. James D. Briley, State, Virginia. In 1980, James D. Briley, along with his brother Linwood and other accomplices, participated in a series of crimes that shocked Richmond, Virginia. One of the most impactful cases was the murder of a woman and her young son, for which James was sentenced to death. Despite multiple appeals and last-minute testimonies, including one from an inmate who claimed another person had confessed to the crimes, the justice process continued. Judge D. Dorch Warner dismissed the testimony as unreliable and confirmed that Duncan Meekins, a key prosecution witness, had been accessible to the defense attorneys. Meekins himself is serving a life sentence for his role in the murders. On December 12, 1984, James D. Briley was executed in the electric chair at the Virginia State Penitentiary, the same chair in which his brother Linwood had been executed 2 months earlier. The execution took place at 11:07 p.m., marking the 42nd execution in the United States since the Supreme Court reinstated the death penalty in 1976 and the 10th that year. Outside the prison, around 450 people gathered, split between death penalty protesters and supporters of justice. The atmosphere was tense. Hours before his death, James Briley shared a last meal of fried shrimp and a soft drink, and spent 2 hours with his 44-year-old wife, Evangeline. That same morning, a riot broke out inside the prison. Inmates armed with improvised weapons attacked guards, leaving at least 9 injured, 4 seriously. Authorities stated the uprising was a desperate attempt to disrupt the execution, but was quickly controlled, as warnings had been received beforehand. James Briley was also known for leading, along with his brother and other inmates, a massive death row escape on May 31, 1984. It was considered the largest of its kind in the U.S. up to that time. All escapees were recaptured shortly afterward. James D. Briley was 28 years old at the time of his execution. He did not make a final statement. He spent 4 years on death row. Jesse De La Rosa, State, Texas. In 1979, Jesse De La Rosa, only 18 years old, was accused in the tragic death of Masoud Ghazali, a young worker at a 7-Eleven store in San Antonio, Texas. According to the police report, Ghazali was found dead in the early hours of August 22nd inside the refrigerated section of the store. Deliveryman Rudy Martinez, who arrived at 4:10 a.m., discovered him lying on the floor, seriously injured. Authorities stated he had been shot twice, once in the back and once in the face. Jesse was arrested shortly afterward and was sentenced to death during the trial. However, over time, his case became one of the most controversial in Texas. Throughout the process, Jesse always maintained that he was not the perpetrator, but also refused to identify the real killer. According to his lawyer, Ron Geyer, Jesse would rather die than betray his companion. Geyer was also clear. Everyone knew Jesse didn't do it, even the police, but no one wanted to stop and listen. On May 15, 1985, Jesse De La Rosa was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville Penitentiary, becoming the first Hispanic person executed in Texas since the death penalty was reinstated in 1976. Present at the execution were members of his family, his defense team, and Judge Roy Barrera, who had set the execution date. Barrera attended from a separate room to avoid causing more pain to Jesse's loved ones. His last meal was simple but meaningful: beefsteak, Spanish rice, flour tortillas, refried beans, jalapenos, chocolate cake, and tea. His final words spoken in Spanish were, "Christ, forgive my brothers and sisters for the sins I have committed. God, forgive me. God, I give my life for my brothers and sisters." Marvin Francois, State, Florida. In 1977, Marvin Francois participated in the murder of 6 people during a robbery at a drug house in Carroll City, Miami. Alongside John Ferguson and Beaufort White, they entered the house pretending to be electrical workers, tied up those present and demanded money, jewelry, and drugs. When more people arrived at the house, they were forced to lie face down. After one of the attackers' disguises was revealed, they decided to execute everyone to leave no witnesses. Francois was the one who shot all 6 victims in the head, while Ferguson attempted to kill 2 others, who survived and later testified. A 4th accomplice, Adolphus Archie, testified that the crime was a contract killing disguised as a robbery. After the crime, the killers gathered at a motel to divide the loot. Francois was sentenced to death. His execution was upheld by the Supreme Court in a 7-2 vote. He was executed in the electric chair on May 29, 1985, at the age of 39. His last meal was large. He requested shrimp, lobster tail, grilled ribs, chicken breast, French fries, sliced tomatoes, watermelon, and strawberries. Marvin Francois spent 8 years on death row before his execution. He left no final words. Charles Milton, State, Texas. In 1977, Charles Milton entered the L&M liquor store in Fort Worth, Texas, armed. He threatened the owners, Leonard and Menery Denton, to steal the store's money and belongings. During the struggle, Menery smashed bottles over Milton's head, while Leonard tried to wrestle the gun away. In the chaos, both were shot. Menery died from a gunshot wound to the heart, and Leonard survived. Milton fled but was identified by Leonard, and the weapon was traced back to him. He was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. His defense argued the shooting was accidental, but the courts upheld the conviction. During his time in prison, Milton converted to Islam. After exhausting all appeals, he was executed by lethal injection on May 25, 1985, at the age of 34. He was the fourth person executed in Texas that year, and the eighth since the state resumed executions in 1982. His last meal was not recorded or made public. He spent 8 years on death row before his execution. His last words were, "There is no God but Allah, and to Him I belong and to Him I return. I want to tell my brothers and sisters to be strong." Morris Odell Mason, State, Virginia. Mason called himself the East Coast Killer and was convicted of the murder of Margaret K. Hand, although he also committed other violent crimes days before, including robberies and sexual assaults. His case was highly controversial because he suffered from schizophrenia and developmental disabilities, raising serious doubts about his mental capacity to understand his execution. Fellow inmates on death row described Mason as having childish and restless behavior, unable to be alone, and struggling to comprehend the situation. During his final hours, he shared a large last meal with 2 guards, but was unable to finish everything and showed signs of confusion about what awaited him. His last meal consisted of 4 Big Macs, 2 large orders of fries, 2 sundae ice creams, 2 apple pies, and 2 large grape sodas. Marie Deans, an anti-death penalty activist who spent time with Mason before his execution, said that Mason behaved like a small child, and that executing him was like killing an 8-year-old. Mason did not give formal last words but requested to be escorted to the execution chamber. He was executed by electrocution on June 25, 1985. He spent approximately 7 years on death row. Henry Martinez Porter, State, Texas. In November 1975, a series of armed robberies in Fort Worth led to the identification of a vehicle used by the suspect. On November 29th, Officer Henry Paul Malou stopped a car driven by Henry Martinez Porter. During the encounter, a struggle occurred. Porter was shot in the abdomen but managed to fatally shoot the officer. Porter then fled to San Antonio, where he was captured 3 days later while recovering in an apartment bathroom. Porter, 33 years old at the time, was a heroin addict with a long criminal and psychiatric history dating back to age 15, including charges of robbery, assault, and forgery. He was diagnosed with personality disorders and signs of paranoid schizophrenia. During his 1976 trial, the defense argued that the shooting was accidental, but the jury did not accept this. He was found guilty of capital murder and sentenced to death. His appeals between 1979 and 1984 were denied. In July 1985, Porter asked his lawyer not to delay the execution. On July 9, 1985, at age 43, Porter was executed by lethal injection. His last meal consisted of steak, refried beans, flour tortillas, salad, ice cream, and chocolate cake. He spent 9 years on death row. In his last words, Porter thanked his spiritual guide and friends, but also harshly criticized the justice system, highlighting racial injustice. "The only thing that condemned me was that I am Mexican and he was a cop. This is the equal justice of the United States. The life of a Mexican is worth nothing. I call you and your society cold-blooded murderers. I'm not saying this with bitterness or anger. I'm saying it with sincerity. I hope God forgives me all my sins. I'm ready, Warden." Charles Rumbaugh, State, Texas. On April 4, 1975, Charles Rumbaugh, at 17 years old, shot and killed the owner of a jewelry store in Amarillo, Michael Fiorillo, 58, during a robbery. A few days before the jewelry store robbery, Rumbaugh had already used 2 guns to rob a motel in San Angelo, taking $350. From an early age, Rumbaugh had a history of criminal behavior. Rumbaugh was arrested and charged with capital murder. After a trial in April 1976, the jury recommended the death penalty. During his time in prison, Rumbaugh escaped from the Potter County Jail with 2 other inmates in December 1975, but he was recaptured shortly after. On September 11, 1985, Charles Rumbaugh was executed by lethal injection in Texas. One day before his execution, he was offered a last meal, but Rumbaugh did not request a special final meal. When asked for his last words, Rumbaugh said, "DJ, Lori, Dr. Witt, all I can say is goodbye, and to the rest of you, although you may not forgive my transgressions, I forgive yours against me. I am ready to begin my journey, and that is all I have to say." William Earl Vandiver, State, Indiana. In 1983, William Earl Vandiver was involved in one of the most brutal murders recorded in Indiana. Alongside his wife Marianne, his brother-in-law Paul Comyatti Jr., and his mother-in-law Rosemary Comyatti, he conspired to murder his father-in-law, 65-year-old Paul Comyatti Sr., in the city of Hammond. On March 20th of that year, Vandiver and his brother-in-law stabbed and mutilated Comyatti Sr., then dismembered the body and placed it in 6 garbage bags, which they abandoned near Lake Michigan. For weeks, Rosemary hid the disappearance by claiming her husband had gone fishing in Canada, but neighbors and friends eventually became suspicious. The crime was discovered almost 2 months later, on May 14th, thanks to an anonymous tip. Marianne Vandiver was arrested first, followed by William, and then Rosemary and Paul Jr. All 4 were charged with murder, but only William Vandiver was sentenced to death. Vandiver, age 35, voluntarily waived all his appeals. The Indiana Supreme Court confirmed he was mentally competent to do so, allowing the execution to proceed. On October 16, 1985, at 12:03 a.m., he was executed in the electric chair at the Indiana State Prison. The procedure was initially flawed. Vandiver continued to breathe after the first shock, so electricity was applied 3 more times before he was declared dead 17 minutes later. In his final hours, he requested a pizza, which he shared with his wife, who was still incarcerated. He also met with his spiritual counselor and expressed a wish to be cremated. William Earl Vandiver spent less than 2 years on death row. He left no public final statement. Carroll Cole, State, Nevada. Between 1948 and 1980, Carroll Edward Eddie Cole carried out a series of murders across different states in the U.S. He was confirmed to be responsible for the deaths of at least 15 people, although he claimed to have killed more than 30. His first victim was a classmate whom he drowned in a lake when he was only 8 years old, a crime that was initially considered an accident until he confessed to it in prison years later. Cole selected his victims in bars and taverns, typically women who reminded him of his mother, whom he hated for her infidelity. His method of murder was strangulation, and in at least one case he implied that he had practiced cannibalism. He was arrested in November 1980 in Dallas, Texas, after being linked to a crime scene. Although the police initially had no suspicion of him, Cole voluntarily confessed to all of his murders. In 1981, he was sentenced to life imprisonment in Texas, but later agreed to face new charges in Nevada, where he was sentenced to death for 2 murders committed in 1977 and 1979. On December 6, 1985, Carroll Cole was executed by lethal injection at the Nevada State Prison. For his last meal, he requested giant fried shrimp, French fries, salad with French dressing, and Boston clam chowder. In his final words, he thanked the judge for the sentence. Hours after his death, his brain was removed and studied at the University of Nevada, Reno in an attempt to find anomalies.